Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to share this work with you. A special welcome to everyone joining on the live stream. Wherever you are, I hope things are well and that you're doing well, especially at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. Thank you so much. While I'm not sure if it's anyone's dream to come hear an hour of lecture on the cornet at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning, I certainly appreciate you being here and supporting me as I take this next step in my doctoral program. I'm very excited about this research. It's something I derive a great deal of passion out of and have really enjoyed building up this sort of body of work that I get to present to you today. And so today I'll be giving you an overview of the Gregson Cornet Concerto, written in 2016. I'll also provide practice suggestions from specific areas, especially in the first movement, and give some performance considerations as well. But a little background first. So, as a doctoral trumpet major, I think there's a fair question to be asked about why, especially this culminating recital, is not about the trumpet, at least explicitly. And I think that's a fair question. And so I wanted to give a little background so that you all know why I'm pursuing this line of research, why I think it's important, and really why it has become sort of my main focus over the last couple of years. And it really starts at Chosenville. Chosenville is a trumpet seminar, and it's in New Hampshire. And basically it's 2 weeks out in a old shaker farm where you stay, live in community, and basically with world-class soloists talk trumpet for 2 straight weeks. And you go to master classes, you hear performances, you get to talk about cool new repertoire, and just meet other people who are as crazy as you are about this admittedly very niche thing. And while there were many great takeaways from that experience, the biggest one was from a master class with the trumpet professor at San Diego State. And she basically, the crux of her class was, if you're gonna do music professionally in whatever capacity, if you're gonna do this and all that that entails, you had better be doing something that you're passionate about, that you enjoy, because the field it can be a tough field. And so you better be doing something that you really, really care about. And so she asked all of us this question: what are you listening to? And if what you're listening to and what you're playing and actively practicing are not the same thing, then what are you doing? And so it really struck me because we had spent basically at this point 2 weeks talking about, for the trumpet players in the room, basically the canon of 20th century French trumpet repertoire, your Tomasis, your Shanes, your Joliets, and such, which is wonderful repertoire. But I realized when I opened my phone and looked at what I was listening to, I was absolutely not listening to that. I wasn't listening to it at all, and it's not because I didn't like it necessarily, but it wasn't the thing that I was looking to spend my outside of Chosenvale time working on. And what I really was listening to was a sort of very niche streaming app called WobPlay. And if you're familiar, those of you who are into the British brass band area, you'll know WobPlay is World of Brass Play. It's a streaming service that is entirely devoted to British style brass banding and the soloists that come out of that tradition. And while I really enjoyed this out of the repertoire, this was the thing that I was spending most of my time listening to, which for those of you guys that are in Cherry Blossom or know me well is not really that surprising to hear. So it was pretty surprising to me because here I was at this fairly intense trumpet festival talking about repertoire that basically I didn't care that much about. And so it started a sort of thought process for me of, well, if I'm not really actively working on the things that I'm listening to, I don't know, I just start doing that. And so I did. And that led me to a couple other experiences that really have driven home this research for me. The next was performing with the JMU Brass Band at the 2014 North American Brass Band Association Championships. And it was my first time performing in this championship, and we played a piece by the composer that we're talking about today, Edward Gregson. It's called Symphony in Two Movements, and it's written for championship level brass bands as a competition piece. And I loved it. It was so cool. It was wonderful to hear brass writing that was engaging and challenging, that pushed the boundaries of composition while still being relatively accessible and fun to listen to. And I really fell in love with Gregson's music at that point. So a couple years later, I also went to the RNCM Festival. This is in Manchester at the Royal Northern College of Music. It's the big brass band festival. And I heard Richard Marshall play live for the first time. Richard Marshall is the recently retired principal cornet of the Black Dyke Mills Band in the north of the UK. And he's sort of the guy for cornet players. He is an establishing figure in this genre. And indeed, as I'll tell you in a sec, he is the one who premiered and commissioned this work that I'm talking about today. But hearing him play cornet and hearing him play music that was beyond the sort of standard canon of Arbin and Clark solos, and playing music that felt modern and relevant in a style and a venue that was something that I really loved, was hugely inspiring. And ever since then, I've basically been hooked. So for my research specifically, in looking at Edward Gregson's Cornet Concerto, I have two main areas of focus. The first sort of larger macro one is that I believe that the cornet is an essential solo and ensemble instrument worthy of independent study. As I said before, I am getting a doctorate in trumpet right now, which is strange because there's only a cornet here. And in a way, that's just how I'd like it to be. I believe that what we do in especially academic or post-secondary music education for the trumpet is derived specifically around checking a box on the cornet, that you are expected to learn one or two Arbin solos and get comfortable with the sort of canon of that repertoire, and then check that box that says, I've played cornet before and I understand how that repertoire works. And what that leaves out is that there's so much more. There's so much more being written if you just look a little bit deeper. And especially currently in the 2000s, but especially over the last 10 or 15 years, the blooming of great repertoire for cornet, especially a great concerto repertoire for cornet and British style brass band, has really grown. And so along that, I believe that the Gregson Cornet Concerto, which I'll talk about today, is an essential part of this diverse repertoire, that there is a great deal to learn from this piece, especially about how to write for the cornet in this idiom in a way that doesn't just sound like your typical theme and variation solo, but also something that really establishes a genre of full-length, concerto-length pieces for the cornet. And as I was talking with my committee earlier on this process, when I didn't really know what angle I wanted to take for my research, the best question that I got that stimulated this project was, what's the gray area? And this is the gray area. There's not a lot of research on cornet concerti. There's some on Edward Gregson, namely for his trumpet concerto and his tuba concerto, which are foundational repertoire pieces for those instruments, but represent a different era of composition, and also a different sort of conception of what a brass instrument can do. The Cornet Concerto expands on, at least for Gregson, his typical harmonic and tonal language, as well as the traditional technical expectations that you'd have for a trumpet player or for a cornet player. So, as I said before, the Gregson Concerto was composed for and premiered in 2016 by Richard Marshall of the Black Dyke Band. It is in 3 movements. I'll focus primarily on the first movement today because 1 hour is certainly enough time for one day to talk about the Cornet Concerto repertoire. I think we'd need a little bit more time, and it's Saturday. So the first movement is called Sonata, and Gregson talks a little bit about how he organized it, the first movement, and called it Sonata as a way to harken back to its sort of original meaning as sounding together, as more of an ensemble conception rather than a formal one. Now, is the first movement essentially in sonata form? Yes. But as a performer looking at the first movement, there's a lot to be gained from the cooperation that you have with the ensemble, or in this case with the piano reduction, that lends itself to a compelling performance. The second movement is called Intermezzo, and while Intermezzo might give the impression that it is short or maybe less intense musically, I find that it actually has some of the most important motivic and thematic development. Most importantly is the subtitle of More Distant Memories, and Gregson uses a theme from one of his test pieces, More Distant Memories, or of Distant Memories, to build the musical ideas in the second movement. There's a sense of nostalgia that permeates this piece, and we'll get into that a little bit as we look at the first movement. The final movement is a rondo, and it's short, and it's fast, it's fun, and really ties together some of the thematic elements, but it really is a closing movement, and it feels, while this piece is tonally and technically beyond what you would sort of expect, it does provide what is a satisfying ending to this full piece. And the whole thing is roughly 17 minutes in length. So as far as brass concerti go, whereas if you were a violin player and you were going to play the Beethoven violin concerto, that's 40 minutes plus. For us, 17 minutes of playing, 17 minutes of on the face time, that's a lot for us. That's getting up there, and so there is this expanded technical demand related to endurance and the ability to play this full piece with band accompaniment over 17 minutes that cannot be ignored. So as I said, Gregson organized his first movement as both being in sonata form, but mostly as a conception of the sonata as sounding together. And in his program notes, he talks about it being built around 4 main ideas. And these 4 main ideas are sort of how I approach this movement, both learning it as well as a sort of musical conception that ties a performance together. The first of the main ideas is a series of cadenzas. The work opens with a cornet cadenza, and cadenzas reappear after different sections throughout this first movement, and indeed in the last movement there is also a cadenza that closes the piece. Next is a fast and rhythmically energetic motive, and when you'll hear it, you'll know why he calls it this. It requires the player, the performer, to jump around octaves, to play in maybe the modes or scales that we as brass players tend to try to sneakily sort of ignore in our practice. And so it's a technical challenge in that way, but certainly one that creates an exciting build for the piece and a way to develop more of these themes. The next section or main idea are bugle calls. There are bugle calls that tie into this idea of distant memory, of reminiscence, that harken back to the cornet or the trumpet's typical role. And there are specific performance considerations for each of these, and I must admit, as a player, the bugle calls were the hardest part in learning this piece for me. The technical demands, while they are within the realm of things you would do already as a sort of normal working playing cornet player, they go beyond a little bit what you would expect a bugle call to be, both in range and technical demands, while retaining a sort of characteristic quality. Essentially, you'll know it when you hear it. And then finally, Gregson writes in this first movement, a lyrical and expressive melody filled with yearning. And this also harkens back to the reminiscent and nostalgic quality of the music, and provides an excellent opportunity to both showcase the cornet's lyrical capabilities, but also as a player to develop the sort of things related to idiomatic sound that are crucial to playing in this style of music. So for the first movement, analytically, as I said, there are cadenzas, this fast and rhythmically energetic motive, bugle calls, and then the lyrical melody. And so as you can see, I've broken it down into 3 sections, and while Gregson talks about this first movement being a sonata in a different sense than sonata form, we essentially do get sort of an A, B, A prime or C section at the end. And so knowing where each of these different ideas appear in the piece can help you or me as a performer categorize the different areas that I need to practice in developing this piece and building it. So in the first section, from the beginning to rehearsal 9, we see cadenzas, the energetic motive, and bugle calls. And that's the crux of that first section. Unsurprisingly, the second section is dominated by the expressive melody. And so much of the practice that you do in this second section is related to building a strong conception of sound quality. And then finally, we have a return to what we had in the A section with the cadenzas, the energetic motives, and the bugle calls from rehearsal 12 to the end. So in looking at the cadenzas from an analytical perspective, the cadenza notes are indicative of the Phrygian mode, and this is confirmed by the ensemble entrance at tempo 1. The biggest giveaway here is the half step between the first 2 notes. So we have this in the accompaniment, we have F, G flat, F, and this bodida figure is consistent throughout the work, both in the solo part as well as in the accompaniment. And it really creates a sense of this modal space, and is also why it was very humbling to begin working on this, as I realized that despite the great efforts of many teachers beforehand, I had not assiduously practiced my modes. And so I certainly paid that debt in learning this piece. The bugle calls analytically provide a harmonic space that is a little bit more accessible, a little bit more tonal. It's certainly more consistent and creates a comfortable space in a sense, which it seems to be intended to do so. The bugle calls are intended to harken back to a specific feeling, a specific conception of what the cornet or the trumpet is. And consequently, when you're playing this bugle call figure, which you can see up top in the example, that it feels like you have taken this opening material and then gone into something that is like a memory. There's this episode of bugle calls, as if you're remembering what the essential function of this family of brass instruments began with. Next, for our fast and rhythmically energetic motive, we are again predominantly, it is again presented predominantly in the Phrygian harmonic space, emphasized by the half step. So anytime that you see this bodida half step motive throughout, you know that there is some sort of harmonic development or melodic development happening that allows the motive to transcend different sections of the piece. And it begins in A Phrygian and then transitions to D Phrygian at rehearsal 2. Analytically, the lyrical and expressive melody is, to my ear, intentionally ambiguous. We have A flat major, F minor, D flat Lydian, all sort of vying for a harmonic space, which works to create a sense of both ambiguity and also nostalgia. That is an effective part of developing the lyrical qualities of the cornet. There's a great deal of parallel thirds, which create a sort of feeling of not necessarily unease, but certainly a sort of mistiness to the music that makes it difficult to ground yourself in one harmonic space. So I'm now going to move over here to talk a little bit about how I practice this, play a little bit, and how I develop the technique to build these different sections. So in looking at this first opening cadenza, as a player, we have a number of different requirements that ground our practice. We need to enter in the upper register. We need to articulate in the upper register. We need to ascend and descend fourths, fifths, and sixths, play loudly in the upper register, and play softly in the lower register. So in the first 6 or so measures, we have 5 discrete technical areas that we need to develop. The good thing is, in developing these techniques, we can essentially build the technical skill we need for each of the subsequent cadenza sections. So for this presentation, my goal was to use resources that were readily available, especially to a aspiring cornet or trumpet player who is looking to dive into this repertoire, as well as someone who is actively playing perhaps in a British-style brass band and wants to continue developing their cornet playing. And so this first example, this first practice suggestion, comes from the Shubrick book. Richard Shubrick was a 20th century teacher and is most famous for the trumpet players in the room, an exercise designed to create confidence in striking the first note. And it sounds something like this. So if you're a trumpet player and you've studied in late high school or early college and you heard that, it probably gave you some sort of potentially uncomfortable flashback to a first or second lesson. It certainly did that for me, but it never goes out of style. This suggestion is taken from number 9, which is a little bit earlier in the book, and all it is designed to do is provide a template for both the fundamental skill, entering into the upper register, but also a template for variation. So to start off, I'll play the exercise and then I'll go through some of the variations that I use that make it a little bit more applicable to the style of the music that we're working with. So on. Fairly straightforward in its original conception. A couple of the ways that I worked this to develop it into something a little bit more applicable is to add both dynamic contrast, but also a difference in articulation. So rather than the original which has a nice separation and front to each note. I tried going to develop real surety and real precision in striking that first note, so that when you go to play this opening cadenza, that first open G is really comfortable. The next thing that I did that allowed this to be a little bit more than just a sort of blank or basic template was to add the trill that we have in this opening cadenza to each of the Gs. And it could sound something like this. And so on. Because in the opening of the cadenza, you have this opening aggressive trill that you need to feel great security on. When we play from G to A in the staff, or above the staff, we're playing sort of around a break, and developing consistency and making both of those notes come out is essential. You don't want to play the first note of this piece and have a trill that just doesn't quite cut it. So the opening trill could sound something like this. Like that. Now, if you look at the second line, we have more opportunity for development. So we can both play it as written, like this. But also begin to have a sort of conception of later parts of the piece, so adding complexity so that it is a little bit more helpful. And one of the ways I did this was to take the first quarter note and adjust the rhythm so it's a little bit closer to what we do in the actual cadenza. So a little bit faster, and then adding the trill on the end. And so on. After working in the Schubert, I found an exercise from Schlossberg. This is page 8, number 30. In the Schlossberg method, the sort of ubiquitous green book that most trumpet and cornet players are used to working with, also part of the public domain, so very free to access and use. This is page 8, number 30, and all this exercise does is expand on the range requirements while still maintaining a style. It also simulates the descent into the lower register that is needed for the rest of the cadenza. And it could sound something like this, at least for the opening. We have this nice bravura entrance that complements well the and so we're able to develop this skill, entering in the upper register, great articulation, idiomatic sound, away from the music, so that when we actually go to work on the piece, there is a good solid habit, a good pattern of playing in this style. Now, we can do a number of things to work on this. My main challenge when working on this exercise was the descent into the upper register, or the lower register. I found that while I could play the opening fairly consistently, my descent into the lower register just wasn't quite sounding the way that I wanted it to. I wasn't accessing the lower register in a way that was as effective as I wanted it to be. And so I worked on it a little bit like this. In taking this first example, you have the da, 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 and then dun, 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 descent into the lower register. And so I broke it up into that first triplet, the descending arpeggio, and built up from there. So it could sound something like this. If we're going to end there, And so you can develop a sense of relaxation of both the embouchure and also the airstream as you descend, which is absolutely necessary for playing this opening cadenza, where we enter in the upper register and then end with the peak of the phrase, the direction of the music, on a low G. And so the whole thing can sound something like this. And so we can connect these registers in a way that is useful. So for our opening cadenza, we'll find our ending note is a little bit lower, but we have to jump around a decent amount to create this musical moment. Right? And so if we're going to start and end, at least for me, I needed to create some sort of connection between those registers. Finally, I spent a decent amount of time working on this exercise from Arbin. And while I think I talked at great length about moving beyond the traditional canon of Arbin's solos, there is something indispensable about Jean-Baptiste Arbin's mid-19th century grand cornet method. It really is a sort of foundational text for those that are not trumpet or cornet players, and something that really never goes out of style. I'm still waiting for something to come around that's going to put the Arbin out of business, but for certain things, it really is the way to go. And in this exercise, from page 129, this is number 5, and it's just a standard interval exercise. There are a million different variations on this. For me and for my development, it's more about a specific way of practicing interval exercises, and this is a just specific, or a example of it that worked for me. What this really helps develop is the ability to move increased distances with some sort of speed expectation and an increased range over time. So for me, I just began it slurred. I began by playing it slurred and playing it with a just nice sort of legato articulation once it was comfortable, and slowly. And it could sound something like this. And so on. The goal is not to go note, 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 like jumping around like that. The goal is to create a conception of a just simple middle set of the embouchure for the entire time and a flexible, pliable airstream. And so once that's comfortable, I'll just add some legato articulation. And then maybe add something that is a little bit more germane to what the articulation markings are in the cadenza. So, so that there's some articulation, but also some slurring. And so after moving through all of these different exercises, looking at the actual motive or cadenza itself, we can apply all of these different things, certainly. But before we do, there are a couple things that I do in my practice to check on various things. For me as a player, the biggest thing was checking the lower register, the things that we were working on with the Schlossberg. And so I started by working that last 16th note figure into the last held note, like this. So there's a feeling of connection. Then and so on, just nice and slowly, but in isolation. I found that the most difficult thing with this figure was starting in the upper register and then, again, relaxing enough to be able to play in the lower register with the type of sound that I wanted. And so taking all of this in aggregate, we can hear all of these different technical demands at play, especially when we play the opening cadenza, and this is what it sounds like. We see more iterations of this cadenza at a variety of different places in the piece. There are certainly at least 3 iterations of similar ideas in the first movement. We also see them again in the final movement. And so developing this skill set to be able to perform this style is essential to a compelling performance of this piece. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about how I developed the skill set for the fast and energetic motive. And this is mostly, at least this example, is taken from rehearsal 2 to rehearsal 4 of this piece. Again, this is a larger section, but in this sort of relatively short section, we have a variety of different technical demands. We need to play in the middle register with great dexterity. There are octave transitions that need to be negotiated. We also need to start thinking about upper register vibrato and what idiomatic vibrato looks like. We need to articulate in the upper register, play some whole tone or sort of non-major or minor scales. We need to work on our low register sound, our single articulation in the low register, and our double articulation in the low register. And so taking that all in aggregate, it feels overwhelming. And my hope is that in looking at this section, it can help make learning this piece feel a little bit less like eating an elephant, that there are manageable bite-sized pieces that we can address. So the first thing I did was go to sort of the old standard. These are the Clark exercises. Herbert L. Clark was the solo cornet player for John Philip Sousa's band in the 19th and early 20th century. And is a foundational person in the pedagogy of both cornet and trumpet playing. His book, The Technical Studies, are essential reading for everyone at most levels of trumpet playing or cornet playing. And I picked Clark 5 specifically because not only does it have you work in the lower register, especially right from the beginning, but it also requires you to ascend 2 octaves, which is something that we need to do in this section of the music. And so I tried my very best, as those who are in my band know, to observe my pianissimo dynamic as closely as possible, but also add articulation and speed up over time so that I'm developing these relevant skills. And it can sound a little bit like this. And so on. Now, in looking at doing this Clark exercise, we're looking to both create a sense of up and down with the dynamic, but also develop pliability with the embouchure. Once comfortable, I'd start adding a legato articulation. So, something like that. And then just add speed over time. Next, to navigate these octave jumps, I went back to the Schlossberg and was really working to create a feeling of flow and closeness between the octaves, rather than feeling like I'm going from upper shelf to lower shelf. really feeling like that there's some sort of middle airflow that was connecting these two octaves. And so I started, as you can see with this exercise, there's just a bunch of different examples that sort of look at the same thing. I started just with the opening one, which sounds a little bit like this. And if anyone asks my wife, Holland, if she's tired of hearing that exercise, she will say, yes, absolutely. This one I needed to work on a lot. And all we'll do is just increase the range. So we'll move up a partial. And again. And then again. And so we can develop the ability to move between these octaves with relative ease and a consistent sound. Next, I just wrote out some of these variations, and these are designed to address the octave issues that are present in the Gregson itself. And so after rehearsal 2, we have a figure that goes like that. So how do you address moving between those octaves quickly with the right sound? Well, you build up to it. This is the first way that I did that, by taking the original Schlossberg exercise and adding an upper neighbor tone. And so on. And then adding legato articulation. And then adding rhythmic complexity. Like so. And these can move up in different sort of transpositions. The goal here is to move beyond the given Schlossberg exercise that works at a core thing and develop an intelligent way of bridging the gap between the thing that you have to play and the core exercise that develops the skill. Finally, I went back to another Arbin exercise. This is page 131, number 5, and it deals specifically with octaves. Now this whole section is gold for developing the ability to move between an octave or a tenth with ease. But again, my goal here is to establish flow between octaves and to use this as a template for variation. So the first couple measures could sound like this. Then some sort of variation could be and then and so on, just to get ourselves closer to what's actually happening in the music. Next, I created an exercise that simply allows for an increased ability of target practice. Entering in the upper register, moving between octaves, establishing the set in an effective way. And so they can sound something like this. And if you have neighbors that you don't like, this is a great way to get them to move. And as you can see, it's a fairly straightforward exercise, but it allows us to create a template for variation. The biggest, most notable sense of variation for me was just taking away that first note, taking away that nice middle register note that allowed me to feel essentially very comfortable in starting. And so by starting in the upper register and descending, it really gets to the heart of a number of the issues that we have in this section. It can sound like this. And then we can add some sort of variation. So, right? And there's still some work for me to do on that one as well. But the goal is to develop a strong sense of slot for each of these different partials, and then the ability to sort of move between them with ease and comfortability. Finally, in my grand plan to get my neighbors to leave, we have a final variation that allows us to transcend 2 octaves. And so it could sound something like this. And then we can do the same sort of variation that we did before. And so on. Next, to address the sort of extended 16th note lines, I did a basic scaffolding, or a basic sort of skeletonization of the original line. And so in this first variation, as you can see, all I'm doing is establishing a sense of where the line is anchored. We start on this written E, then we ascend up to a G in this first example. So it could sound something like this. Then we add complexity. And finally, something a little bit closer to the actual line. All of this in pursuit of developing an ease of technique that allows for a compelling performance. And let me play a little bit of this section from 2 to 4. And so on. Finally, I think for today, I want to look a little bit at the bugle calls, which admittedly were the most challenging for me. Gregson writes them as being in modo militare, so unsurprisingly a sort of military conception of sound, and indicates that there should be no vibrato, which is sort of unusual for this style, and so its absence really is a musical bellwether for change of style. You expect it always. In terms of practicing these, you're really looking at a few core things. Single articulation, a crisp single articulation that allows you to play this style of music. Also partial flexibility, so the ability to move between notes without using your valves, and then upper register articulation. So to begin developing this technique, I went back to Arbin. This is page 188, number 135. And all it does is help us develop the fanfare style of triplet that is used in this section of the music. It could sound something like this. I began this by working slowly, and while I certainly am not playing at the given 1/16 to the quarter note tempo, it is fast enough and crisp enough for it to be useful for this section of the concerto. Some variation came in the form of moving from the previous exercise to page 189, number 138. And all this does is add some sort of 16th note texture that is a little more similar to what you're playing in the piece. And it could sound something like this. Now, obviously, starting slowly and playing rhythmically precise are essential, but one thing that I did that really helped develop a consistent articulation with this was to just play the rhythm on one note, and it sounded kind of like this. So that there's a sense of consistency to the articulation. As brass players, as we traverse different registers, our tendency is to sort of articulate or change our articulation based on the register that we're in. And the more that we can keep it consistent, the more accurate we are. And so what I would do is go back and forth between the two. So for example, to me that feels much more consistent. The sound feels easier and it feels like I'm moving less, which makes the ability to traverse a wider range, a register range, feel a lot more comfortable. Next is another Schlossberg, and this is just a basic flexibility exercise. Where this changes is in the addition of articulation. So as you can see here, we are simply going throughout the register without changing notes, and it can sound like, or without changing fingerings, and it can sound like this. But we can also add some variation to this that makes it a little bit more useful for this exercise. So shortening it, a basic flexibility exercise, expanding the register, above and below, and then adding the articulation that we need. Now we can expand on this by articulating the entire thing, something like this. To create a sense of flow and consistency to our articulation. in closing, I'd like to talk a little bit about the lyrical and expressive melody filled with yearning. And while there is a great deal to discuss in terms of style here, the main thing to consider is the proper application of vibrato. And so I've created what I believe is a useful exercise for people who are trying to play idiomatic vibrato in this style. It's much more than you would expect or use as a trumpet player. And so by both listening to players exhibit it, but also by developing it in a direct and intentional way, you can create something that's very warm and useful. And so to do this, I simply set my metronome to 100 and move up and down on the pitch at varying levels of speed. So it could sound something like this. The open note heads up there are a sort of almost quarter tone bend up from the original pitch. It could sound something like this. Doesn't sound so great like that, so let's speed it up. We're getting there. Now 16th note. And then finally, something that is warm and something more akin to what you would have maybe as a string player in terms of your usage of vibrato. Now, one way to really apply this is to take the Red Book hymns and play any of them and really use them to apply the vibrato in a pretty low stakes melodic place. So it could sound something like this. This is number 3 from the Red Book hymns. And we can take this vibrato after developing it in this way, perhaps by going up an octave or transposing into a register that's a little bit closer to what's in the concerto, and apply it to the music. So it could sound something like this from the concerto. As you can see, the vibrato is consistent. It is sort of a permeative part of the idiomatic cornet sound in this style of music. So in closing, while this is a sort of overview of how I both practice this piece and continuing to develop a consistent performance of it, it is certainly intended to be more of a template rather than a you must play these 3 or 4 exercises. The biggest takeaway and my hope is that if you are a person, especially a brass player or a trumpet player or a cornet player that is trying this repertoire, that you now have sort of an idea of how to approach this piece, what the important things are in this piece, but also how to develop an idiomatic sound quality, how to use the sort of extant resources that we have as part of our standard pedagogical canon, and how to ultimately build a compelling performance of Gregson's, I think, wonderful concerto. So, thank you very much for being here. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much.